All right, good morning. 4.1 is a lot of definitions. So this is a good uh, flashcard topic. So the first thing is species. How do we define a species? So it helps to first think about the broader picture. So first we have the individual. Okay. After an individual, you have a population. After a population, you have a community. After community, you have ecosystem. And then after ecosystem, you have biome. So, the key words for a species is that it's a population that is interbreeding and they can produce fertile offspring. A classic example of something that does not produce offspring that's fertile is a donkey crossed with a horse equals a mule. Now, a mule are infertile. So even though a donkey and a horse can produce offspring, the offspring are not fertile. So you may have species live in the same area. You may have species that can possibly breed, but they don't. Therefore, they're not the same species. So this helps to understand this, is that there are either pre-zygotic barriers. So, and then there is post-zygotic barriers. So, zygote is a fertilized egg. So, the mule is an example of a post-zygotic, zygotic, not good, zygotic. So we have post-zygotic and pre-zygotic. Pre-zygotic barriers, there's three of them. Basically, we have temporal, we have behavioral, and we have geographic. So, the geographic is an easy one. For example, there's a mountain or there's a river that separates two species. So a geographic barrier separates two species, such as a mountain or a river. A river might separate a mouse, but it won't separate a horse. And a horse cannot cross a mountain very easily, so a mountain might separate a horse. Anyways, behavioral, a good example of behavioral is songbirds, because different birds have different songs. So that's the example of a behavioral. And then there is temporal, which would be like seasons. So flowers only blossom at certain times of the year. So all of these are barriers that keep species from interbreeding. So definition of species is a population of interbreeding organisms that produce fertile offspring. Those are your key words. So, an individual is obviously just the first one, the individual. You have a population. This is a group living in the same place and time. Okay. Community is the interactions between different populations. Okay. The ecosystem is the interactions between different populations. So a good way to think of this is predator and prey. So when the bunnies increase, the fox increases, and then the fox eats the bunnies, and the bunnies decrease, and the fox decreases. And then biome is just refers to would be like all the rainforest. So an ecosystem might be a rainforest in Vietnam or a rainforest in Indonesia, but then a biome would be all rainforest or temperate rainforest or temperate forest or chaparral or desert or estuaries or tundra or taiga. So these are all different biomes that are around the whole world. So we get larger and larger and larger. Individual, a population, a community, ecosystem, and biome. Okay. Now we get into feeding. So there is auto and heterotrophic. So trophic is a suffix, and auto and hetero is the prefix. So this means self, this means different. So an autotrophic organism makes their own organic compound. So auto makes their own organic compounds. Heterotropics must consume organic compounds. Okay? There is a prefix before auto. You can be photo or chemo. So you can be chemo autotrophic or photo autotrophic, right? Okay? So if you're using photo, you're obviously using light, and chemo would be using chemical. Okay? So example of a photo autotroph would be algae. And a chemo autotroph would be thermos bacillus, which is the bacteria THERMOS. Thermos bacillus. This bacteria, if you remember from genetics, this bacteria is where we got TAC. This is where we got TAC from. It's used for PCR. They come from the ocean sea vents, so they live off the heat from the ocean sea vents at the bottom of the ocean. So we have autotrophs, okay? You might have learned this before simply as producer, consumer, decomposer, right? So your producers are your autotrophs, your chemo autotrophs. So producers are your chemo autotroph, your photo autotroph, right? Consumers, we have primary, secondary, third, fourth. Okay, so primary, these would be your primary. These are your herbivores, and these are your carnivores. And remember, if you switch between 1 and 2, you are a omnivore. And then decomposers, there's decomposers, and there's sapotrophs. Now, your decomposers, these are your bacteria and your fungi. Your sapotroph, might be a vulture or a worm. Now, the difference between these two guys is internal versus external digestion. So these guys have external digestion. They will secrete enzymes. They secrete enzymes that break down the material and then they absorb it. Okay? Whereas sapotrophs, these have internal digestion. So a vulture, even a pig is part sapotroph. So vulture, worms, pigs, they will eat dead, decaying organic material. Both of them, both decomposers sapotrophs, they eat dead / decaying matter. So they both do that. Difference is the decomposers are external digesters. They secrete enzymes and then they absorb the nutrients and then they assimilate it. Remember, we absorb and assimilate. So we absorb simple sugars. We break down all those carbohydrates, protein, lipids. We break them down to the monomers and absorb them and reassimilate them. So they do this by externally, by releasing enzymes that break it down and absorb it, whereas sapotrophs, they use internal digestion. Okay, so they're going to eat them and then use the stomach to do it. All right? This is mostly so this is covered in most of 4.1. The last thing about 4.1 is nutrient recycling. There's some really interesting questions they like to ask about this. Usually the mark schemes are focused on basically like the carbon cycle, right? So there's the carbon cycle, there's the water cycle, there's the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Really the only one you need to know is carbon. You only need to know carbon and water and nitrogen cycle. Okay? So carbon is recycled in the ecosystem. So decomposers are obviously gonna decomposers are gonna put nitrogen back in the soil. And decomposers will break down carbon compounds into nutrients to be reabsorbed back in the soil and then reabsorbed by the plants. So on the life cycle goes. So sustainability is defined as not using materials faster than they can naturally be replaced. So not using raw materials faster than they can be naturally reproduced. So for example, soil is not sustainable. Soil takes thousands of years to make soil. So without us inventing fertilizer, making natural soil we can speed the process up by composting, but making soil naturally takes thousands of years. So I think of soil as something that's easily fixed and replaceable, and it's not. All right, this kind of is it. This is kind of it for 4.1. So I will stop here for 4.1.